Program on the line with us, David Pepper, the lawyer, writer, his latest book, Saving Democracy, a user's manual for every American, which you should get. Available to find bookstores everywhere. Political activist, former elected official, adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati College of Law, served as chairman of the Ohio Democratic Party between 2015 and 2021, and writes a brilliant Substack, davidpepper.substack.com, or Pepperspectives. Which is free, and I strongly encourage you to subscribe to. I do, and I absolutely love it, right down to his occasional sharing his paintings with us. David, welcome back to the program. I was blown away by this piece that you did just a couple of days ago. It's titled Act Wisely, a chilling letter, about this letter that says that you may be in violation of federal law, a violation that could be perilous, criminal penalties of up to $20,000 and 5 years in prison. Tell us about this.
Yeah, this was a letter handed to me by someone in Ohio. It was a letter from the Attorney General of Ohio to the university and college presidents in Ohio that, as you said, if you read it and didn't know any better, you'd think a bunch of college and university presidents were about to get hauled off to jail. And what he was writing about was this announcement a few months ago by the vice president, by the Department of Education, that they were clarifying that federal work-study programs could be used for certain types of civic engagement, including voter registration, serving as poll workers, and other things. And this was the Attorney General of Ohio literally suggesting that the vice president and the Department of Education were apparently recommending something that was illegal. And the reason I highlighted the letter, there are a lot of reasons, but it just shows how deathly afraid Republicans are. Remember, Republican attorneys general are now so partisan they were part of planning January 6th, for goodness sakes.
Yep.
But these Republicans attorney general jumped over this right away, including the one in Ohio. They want to discourage any type of voter registration, including, in this case, allowing students to engage in civic engagement like registration, poll workers, to the point where they're writing letters where it makes it sound like people are going to jail. And one of the parallels I drew was back in the Jim Crow days. This is what they did in Jim Crow states. They tried to intimidate and did intimidate the most basic voter registration activity. So it is chilling that in 2024 we have the lawyer for the state of Ohio acting like university presidents are somehow on the verge of engaging in criminal activity by simply having students follow a federal guidance that they can actually do federal work studies and use it in part, at least, to register voters or serve as poll workers. It's a really telling moment among many sort of dark moments right now.
Yeah, it really is amazing. And correct me if I'm wrong, he's not just the lawyer for the state of Ohio. He's the chief law enforcement officer, is he not?
Yeah, he is. And he also, by the way, represents these schools. State colleges, universities are represented by the Attorney General. But he wasn't writing to them, and I say this as a lawyer. I once ran for the position. He wasn't writing to them as their lawyer, asking what they want to do and saying, "Here's how I can help you, follow this new rule." You almost would have thought he was the prosecutor. Now, the interesting thing I point out in my Substack is the DOJ actually would be the one to prosecute this if it was a violation of federal law, right? Well, the DOJ, at least when it comes to other aspects of political activity, has made it clear that voter registration is perfectly appropriate. So he's literally misstating to his own clients what the federal approach to this is and suggesting that if they do any kind of activity like voter registration, they are facing criminal penalties. It's an outrageous letter, especially when you realize it's coming from someone who's supposed to be a lawyer serving these universities as who are supposed to be their clients.
So how are the universities reacting to this? I mean, are the presidents of the universities freaking out and shutting down things like, voter registration drives on campus, or are they
My guess is, I heard from someone offline that it's been quiet because, again, this is the whole point of this is intimidate. Mm-hmm. And the letter basically says the last two words are wisely. It's like a threatening sort of out of a Goodfellas or something type of letter.
Yeah.
And my guess is because he also is the chief law enforcement officer who can prosecute things, my guess is it will work largely as he hopes it will, which is to basically make them think, well, we sort of want to do this. We wished this was something that could have been good for students. But why bother when our own lawyer is suggesting we're going to literally violate criminal law, which to me, my reading of it, I'm not trying to claim to be the lawyer here, but it doesn't seem to be at all the case that that's the risk here, at least for anything that's a good faith effort to follow the policy announced by the federal government about its federal program. But what I heard internally from someone who has ties to one such school is, yeah, this really had sort of sent a wave through the college and higher education leaders here. That this letter from their lawyer was basically saying, don't you dare do this or you might be in trouble. So my guess is it's like everything else, a muted response. By the way, one thing I didn't put in the Substack, this is part of a decade of efforts to subdue young voters voting. Obama won Ohio and a number of other states as a key part of the coalition that got him Ohio, blue Ohio, were young voters.
Right.
Often out-of-state voters who went to school in Ohio and voted in Ohio. So whether it's a recent strict voter ID law, whether it was other attempts to keep young people from voting, this is part of that theme, which is anything they can do to keep young people from voting, or in this case, registering. And by the way, who is maybe the number one impacted group by a new strict voter ID law? Young voters who often don't have driver's licenses. They're not driving as much anymore. Well, this was a way to keep sort of efforts of getting them registered from happening. So it's all part of this broader, very cynical efforts in states like Ohio to just knock people off the rolls, and in this case, not allow any effort to put them back on the rolls.
It's incredible. We had Greg Palast, the former BBC and Guardian investigative reporter, on the program a couple of weeks ago, and he made the point that if Georgia and Texas allowed everybody to vote, in the context of these very, very restrictive voting rules that they have, that these would both be blue states right now. Is that the case in Ohio?
I'll put it this way. When we, before the really intense purging of voters that followed Obama turning Ohio blue in 08 and 12, yeah, we leaned a little blue when people got energized. If you look back now, and I put this in my first book, if you look back at the key voting blocks in urban Ohio, they have been decimated by the nonstop purging of voters from the rolls. So what this letter that we started with is about is government in Ohio has suppressed the hell out of the coalition that it's afraid of. And and attorneys general, like the guy who wrote that letter, have defended that as legitimate voting lawmaking in court and told courts, ignore the fact that it has a disproportionate impact on certain voters. So they've crushed key elements of the Obama coalition, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Dayton. But on the flip side, when there's an effort to try and reach out to some of the parts of the population that are disproportionately impacted by all that purging and suppression, then they swoop in like they do this letter and say, oh, you're not allowed to do that. You can't restore these people to the rolls, but they are the very lawyers who have been in court fighting, defending, removing them from the rolls.
Well,
so yeah, you bet it has changed the overall makeup of the electorate of Ohio, the nonstop purging that's had a disproportionate impact on the very voters that elected Barack Obama.
And wasn't it Ohio that took this to the Supreme Court, or got taken to the Supreme Court? Husted versus U.S., wasn't it? Your Secretary of State, I think it was 2018, wanted to have the legal right to basically do caging, to purge voters based on really, really thin or tenuous evidence. And in fact, as I recall, in the dissent, I mean, this was all Republicans on the Supreme Court who said, yes, go ahead and do it. But in the dissent, I don't recall who wrote this, but it might have been John Paul Stevens.
Breyer.
It was Breyer, thank you, wrote that, on average, about 4%, correct me if I'm wrong on my numbers here, about 4% of people move every year, but Ohio was purging 10% of people?
Yeah, I mean, basically, yeah, absolutely. Breyer's dissent is brilliant. But what happened, when I call my book A Laboratories of Autocracy, part of the meaning of that is whenever they get away with something in one state, they bring it to other states. So this was a very important case for the Republican cause. By 5-4, they upheld a purging process that used the trigger of that process to be infrequent voting. And what Breyer pointed out is infrequent voting is a terrible proxy for if someone has moved or passed away, which is a legitimate reason to remove them from the rolls. So every year, about 1% of people pass away. It's like you said, about 2 to 4% may move out of a county. But every couple years, about 50% of people don't vote. And they are using non-voting as the proxy, which is, again, a very high number for the very small number of people who legitimately can be removed from the polls. And by doing so, they're capturing so many more people in the net of purging that actually should be in the net. And then that's why, as I said, when you're going off of infrequent voters, people who move a lot within a county, you're basically targeting poor voters, in many cases, voters of color, young voters. That's who's been caught up in the purging. And that's why we know that they've purged far more people in Ohio than the population shifted. They're getting rid of voters who are still where they were, but they just voted infrequently. And by a 5-4 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court said, oh, you can do that anywhere in the country. And that's what's happening in other states. And the Secretary of State here was proud that this method of knocking certain voters off the rolls, even though they were still there, they just sat out an election or two. They were proud that that was now going to be something other states could do as well.
Amazing. David Pepper, Substack.com. David, thank you so much for dropping by.
Thanks, Tom. Good to see you.
Keep up the great work.